There's a quiet irony in how we often dismiss ancient civilizations as primitive, when in reality, their wisdom holds secrets that could redefine our modern world. Think about it. How could societies without advanced technology achieve feats that still baffle us today? Take the Inca, for example, who transformed the unforgiving Andes into a thriving agricultural empire with terraces that defied gravity and irrigation systems so precise they put modern engineering to shame. These weren't just survival tactics, they were masterpieces of ingenuity born from a deep understanding of nature's rhythms, and yet we've barely scratched the surface of what these cultures knew. What if the answers to our greatest challenges, climate change, food shortages, even societal disconnect, aren't waiting in some futuristic lab, but are instead buried in the past? Imagine uncovering lost technologies that harnessed renewable energy centuries before the term existed, or philosophies that fostered harmony between humans and the environment long before sustainability became a buzzword. These civilizations didn't just survive, they thrived by working with the world, not against it. Their innovations weren't just practical, they were profound, rooted in a worldview that saw everything as interconnected. This video is a journey into that forgotten wisdom, a chance to rediscover the brilliance of cultures that time almost erased. We'll explore how primitive civilizations solved problems we're still struggling with today, from architecture that stood the test of millennia to medicinal knowledge that modern science is only now beginning to validate. Along the way, you'll see how their legacy isn't just a relic of the past, it's a blueprint for a better future. So let's step into their world and uncover the timeless lessons they left behind. Because sometimes looking back is the best way to move forward. There's something humbling about realizing that some of the most sustainable farming practices in history were perfected thousands of years before terms like carbon footprint or regenerative agriculture entered our vocabulary. Take the Native American Three Sisters method, a brilliant example of how ancient cultures worked with nature rather than against it. Corn, beans, and squash weren't just planted together randomly. They formed a symbiotic trio where each plant supported the others. The corn provided a sturdy stalk for the beans to climb. The beans fixed nitrogen in the soil to nourish the corn, and the sprawling squash leaves shaded the ground, keeping weeds at bay and retaining moisture. This wasn't just farming, it was a self-sustaining ecosystem, a lesson in balance modern agriculture has largely forgotten. Compare that to today's monoculture fields, where endless rows of a single crop drain the soil of nutrients, requiring synthetic fertilizers and pesticides just to keep yields stable. The difference is staggering. Anthropologists like Dr. Jane M.T. Pleasant have called the Three Sisters system one of the most sophisticated agronomic innovations in human history, and it's hard to disagree. These ancient farmers didn't just grow food, they cultivated resilience, understanding that diversity wasn't just beneficial, it was essential for survival. But here's the real kicker. These techniques aren't relics of the past. Farmers and researchers today are rediscovering their value, experimenting with polyculture systems to reduce water use, rebuild soil health, and even combat climate change. Imagine if we took these ancient blueprints seriously. How much could we reduce our reliance on chemicals, our water waste, our soil degradation? The answers might not lie in the next high-tech gadget, but in the wisdom of those who thrived for centuries without stripping the land bare. And this is just one example. From the rice terraces of the Philippines to the agroforestry practices of the Amazon, primitive civilizations left behind a treasure trove of sustainable solutions waiting to be revived. The precision of ancient architecture isn't just impressive, It's downright perplexing. How did the Egyptians align the Great Pyramid of Giza with true north to within a fraction of a degree, or match its sides to the cardinal directions with near-perfect symmetry? This wasn't just stacking stones, it was celestial engineering on a scale that would challenge modern builders even with laser-guided tools. Some researchers point to the use of the pole star or the sun's shadow during equinoxes, but the truth is, we still don't have all the answers. And then there's the weight. Each of the pyramid's 2 million stone blocks averages 2.5 tons, hauled into place without wheels, pulleys, or iron tools. The prevailing theory involves ramps, but reconstructions show how labor-intensive even that would have been. What's often overlooked is the ingenuity behind their problem-solving, wetting sand to reduce friction for sleds, or using counterweights to lift heavy loads. These weren't just construction workers, they were physicists without textbooks, turning limitations into breakthroughs. Now, shift your gaze to the jungles of Central America, where the Mayans built temples that doubled as acoustic wonders. At Chichen Itza, the Temple of Kukulkan creates an eerie echo mimicking the cry of the sacred Quetzal bird when you clap at its base, a feat achieved through meticulously calculated stair angles and platform dimensions. Was this just artistic flair? Unlikely. Archaeoacoustics experts suggest these sound effects were intentional, woven into rituals to amplify the voices of priests or simulate divine communication. And let's not forget the myth of sound-based levitation, the idea that certain frequencies could move massive stones. While mainstream science dismisses this, experiments with vibrating sand forming geometric patterns hint that ancient builders might have harnessed resonance in ways we're only beginning to grasp. Behind every chisel mark and calculated slope lies a deeper truth. These structures weren't just functional, they were bridges between Earth and cosmos. The pyramids mirrored the Milky Way, Mayan temples aligned with solstices. To dismiss them as primitive is to ignore their genius, a fusion of mathematics, astronomy, and spirituality we've yet to fully decode. Perhaps that's the real marvel, not just how they built, but why. These weren't monuments to ego, they were dialogues with the universe. Long before libraries and hard drives, humanity's greatest wisdom traveled not on parchment or pixels, but through the living breath of storytellers. Indigenous cultures perfected the art of weaving knowledge into narratives so vivid, so unforgettable, they could survive centuries without a single written word. Consider the Aboriginal Dreamtime stories. Far more than myths, these oral masterpieces are intricate databases of survival. A single tale might encode the migratory patterns of animals, the medicinal uses of plants, even the warning signs of droughts, all wrapped in the adventures of ancestral spirits. The Karajari people of Western Australia, for instance, used songs to map water sources across vast deserts, with each melody serving as an acoustic GPS. Miss a single verse and you might miss the only waterhole for miles. This wasn't just entertainment, it was life or death education disguised as art. What's truly remarkable is how these traditions turned memory into a communal project. Polynesian navigators didn't just memorize star paths, they chanted them in rhythmic verses, their bodies swaying to mimic ocean swells. The Maori of New Zealand passed down genealogies through haka dances, where every stomp and shout reinforced kinship ties back to legendary ancestors. These methods tapped into something neuroscience now confirms. Information set to rhythm or movement is far harder to forget. When the Inuit sang of sea ice formations, or the griots of West Africa recited centuries of history through epic poems, they were using the brain's own wiring as a preservation tool. Yet somewhere along the way, we traded campfires for screens, swapping immersive storytelling for fragmented sound bites. modern education often prioritizes rote memorization over narrative depth, leaving us with facts that fade as quickly as they're learned. Indigenous cultures, by contrast, understood that knowledge sticks when it's felt, when it carries the weight of emotion, the pulse of music, the shared heartbeat of a community gathered to listen. Perhaps that's why their survival skills outlasted empires. This raises a haunting question. In our age of endless data, have we forgotten how to tell stories that truly matter? Not just stories that inform, but those that transform, the kind that knit generations together, that turn lessons into legacies. The answer might lie in the way these ancient rituals doubled as social glue. Take the potlatch ceremonies of Pacific Northwest tribes, where feasting and gift-giving weren't just economic exchanges but living classrooms. Elders used these gatherings to recount family histories, demonstrate carving techniques, even settle disputes through parable rather than punishment. Every song, every dance, every shared meal was a thread in the fabric of collective memory. And it's this very fabric that modern society struggles to replicate, a reminder that wisdom isn't just about what we know, but how we pass it on. Imagine a courtroom where disputes aren't settled with legal jargon or fines, but through feasts, dances, and the giving of gifts. This was the essence of the Native American potlatch, a ceremony so powerful it could mend broken alliances, redistribute wealth, and even restore honor without a single word of hostility. Tribes like the KWAKW adjective WAKW along the Pacific Northwest coast turned conflict resolution into an art form where rivals competed not through violence but through generosity. The more a leader gave away blankets, carved masks, even canoes, the more prestige they gained. It was a brilliant system that transformed ego into communal benefit, ensuring no one hoarded resources while others struggled. Psychologists like Dr. Michael Cross note these rituals tapped into a deep human truth. Shame and pride are far more effective motivators than punishment. Now cross the globe to the Maasai of East Africa, where coming-of-age rites like the Unoto ceremony turn teenagers into warriors through trials of endurance and communal bonding. For weeks, young men live together, enduring physical challenges while elders impart wisdom through song and story. The climax, a single-file dance where each warrior's jump must match the rhythm of the group, a visceral lesson in unity. Anthropologist Dr. Tepelit Ol-Setoti observed that these rituals didn't just mark adulthood, they rewired brains to prioritize the collective over the self. Modern neuroscience backs this up. Synchronized movement releases oxytocin, the bonding hormone, creating trust that lasts decades. Compare that to today's isolation, where many navigate life's milestones alone, graduations reduced to emails, birthdays spent scrolling through screens. Psychiatrist Dr. Suvama warns that this erosion of communal rights correlates with rising anxiety and depression. We've privatized joy and grief, she says, when our brains evolved to process these emotions in circles, not solitude. Ancient cultures understood something we've forgotten. Healing isn't just personal, it's relational. Take the Dagara people of Burkina Faso, who treat mental distress not with pills, but with village-wide rituals. When someone suffers, the community gathers for days of drumming, chanting, and storytelling, reaffirming the individual's place in the social fabric. Psychologist Dr. Malidoma Somé explains, their diagnosis isn't chemical imbalance but disconnection. The cure isn't isolation but reintegration. It's a perspective that flips modern psychiatry on its head, suggesting depression might be less about broken brains and more about broken bonds. This holistic view extended to physical health too. The Cherokee didn't just treat illness, they restored harmony between body, spirit, and environment through ceremonies like the going to water ritual, where prayers and herbal medicine worked in tandem. Herbalist Dr. J.T. Garrett notes, their healers knew sickness often began in the community, so the community had to be part of the cure. In an age where hospitals separate patients from loved ones and nature, these traditions whisper a radical idea. Maybe healing isn't something we do alone in sterile rooms, but together under open skies. Long before pharmacies lined our streets, healers looked to the forests, deserts, and mountains for remedies that treated more than just symptoms. They nurtured the whole person. Take Ayurveda, India's 5,000-year-old science of life, which didn't just fight disease but sought to harmonize body, mind, and spirit through herbs, diet, and meditation. Its central premise, imbalance causes illness, and true healing requires restoring equilibrium. A simple example, turmeric wasn't just a spice, it was prescribed for inflammation, detoxification, even mood disorders, a practice modern studies now validate with findings about curcumin's antioxidant properties. Meanwhile, halfway across the world, the Amazon's shamans brewed ayahuasca, a vine-based concoction used not to escape reality but to confront it. Tribes like the Shipibo-Canibo viewed illness as spiritual dislocation, and ceremonies with this potent tea became journeys to reclaim lost fragments of the self. Neuroscientists studying its effects report heightened neuroplasticity, as if the brain itself rewires during these rituals, echoing what indigenous cultures called soul retrieval. Then there's traditional Chinese medicine, where the body's vital energy flows like rivers, and blockages manifest as pain or fatigue. Acupuncture needles weren't merely stimulating nerves, they were redirecting this invisible current, a concept that baffled Western doctors until functional MRI scans revealed how needling specific points triggers measurable changes in brain activity. Even something as mundane as ginger, prescribed for nausea in ancient texts, is now proven to outperform synthetic antiemetics in chemotherapy patients. But perhaps the most striking rediscovery comes from Egypt, where tombs held pots of honey so well preserved they're still edible after millennia. The ancients slathered it on wounds, unknowingly harnessing its hydrogen peroxide content and acidic pH to kill bacteria, a practice revived in modern burn units where antibiotic-resistant infections meet their match in this golden elixir. What's startling isn't just their accuracy but their perspective. Where modern medicine often isolates organs or symptoms, these traditions saw interconnectedness. A healer in the Andes might treat a stomach ulcer with herbs, yes, but also songs to calm the patient's spirit, recognizing stress as a root cause long before the term psychosomatic existed. Or consider the Maori of New Zealand, whose massage techniques, or rama-romi, addressed physical pain by releasing emotional trauma stored in muscle tissue, a notion now explored in somatic therapy. Yet for every remedy we've validated, countless others linger in obscurity. The Cherokee used black walnut hulls for parasitic infections, a remedy recent studies show contains juglone, a compound lethal to tapeworms. Siberian shamans ingested fly agaric mushrooms to induce visions that diagnosed illness, a practice modern ethnobotanists link to the mushroom's ibotenic acid, which crosses the blood-brain barrier to alter perception. Even Hippocrates' use of willow bark for pain foreshadowed aspirin's discovery. But what about the hundreds of other plants in his notes still untested? This begs a profound question. If our ancestors mapped such intricate paths to wellness without microscopes or clinical trials, what else might their traditions hold? Laboratories are now racing to decode indigenous pharmacopoeias, from the Seri people's cactus-based diabetes treatments to the Kalahari Sans hunger-suppressing hudia. But the real revelation isn't just in the substances themselves, it's in the worldview behind them. these cultures didn't separate physical health from ecological harmony or community well-being. A healer in Bali might prescribe planting trees alongside herbal tonics, understanding that healing the land heals its people. As we face epidemics of loneliness and environmental collapse, perhaps their greatest lesson isn't a specific remedy, but the radical idea that true health is a web, not a checklist. Picture standing on the deck of a canoe in the middle of the Pacific, no land in sight, no compass, just the vast expanse of stars overhead. This was the everyday reality for Polynesian navigators, who crossed thousands of miles of open ocean using nothing but the sky as their map. Their secret, the star compass, a mental masterpiece that divided the horizon into 32 directional houses, each marked by the rising and setting points of key stars. They didn't just memorize constellations, they read the ocean's swells, the flight patterns of birds, even the subtle shifts in cloud formations, all woven into a navigation system so precise it rivaled modern GPS. And here's the astonishing part. They passed this knowledge down orally for generations with no written manuals or instruments. When European explorers first encountered Polynesians, they couldn't fathom how these primitive sailors consistently reached tiny, remote islands without getting lost. The answer lay in a celestial literacy we've all but erased. Now, shift your gaze to the sands of ancient Mesopotamia, where Babylonian astronomers charted the heavens with clay tablets instead of telescopes. These weren't stargazers, they were mathematicians, tracking Venus's cycles with such accuracy their predictions deviated by mere hours over centuries. Their Enuma Anu Enlil, a collection of celestial omens, tied planetary movements to weather patterns and even political events, blending science with symbolism. But perhaps their most enduring legacy was the zodiac, a 12-part division of the sky that laid the groundwork for both astrology and modern astronomy. Critics dismiss their work as superstition, yet their calculations of lunar eclipses were so reliable they're still referenced in archaeological studies today. Then there's the Dogon people of Mali, whose knowledge of Sirius B, a star invisible to the naked eye, sparked decades of debate. Tribal elders described it as dense, tiny, and orbiting Sirius in an elliptical pattern, details matching modern astrophysics. Skeptics argue this wisdom came from contact with Western astronomers, but anthropologists like Marcel Grioul recorded these accounts in the 1930s, long before telescopes confirmed Sirius B's existence. Whether through ancient contact or inexplicable tradition, the Dogon's celestial insights remain one of archaeology's most tantalizing puzzles. But here's what truly unites these cultures. Their sky wisdom wasn't just practical, it was sacred. For the Polynesians, stars were ancestors guiding voyages. For the Babylonians, planets were gods dictating fate. The Mayans aligned pyramids with Venus's path, turning temples into cosmic calendars. Even Stonehenge's slabs, positioned to capture solstice sunbeams, reveal a universal truth. These civilizations didn't just observe the heavens, they conversed with them, seeing the cosmos as a living, breathing force intertwined with daily life. In an age where light pollution obscures all but the brightest stars, we've lost more than just navigation tools. We've severed a connection that once rooted humanity to something greater. Yet fragments of this wisdom linger. Modern sailors still learn to shoot the stars as a backup to electronics. Farmers in Nepal plant by lunar phases, yielding harvests that defy industrialized agriculture. And astrophysicists now collaborate with indigenous elders, comparing satellite data with oral star charts only to find startling overlaps. The irony. The more we advance, the more we circle back to truths these ancient cultures knew by heart, that the sky isn't just a void to conquer, but a mirror reflecting our place in the universe. Perhaps reclaiming their celestial literacy isn't about turning away from technology, but remembering how to look up. Time was never just numbers on a face to ancient civilizations. It was the pulse of the cosmos, written in sunlight and shadows. The Maya didn't need gears or batteries to track centuries. Their long-count calendar carved into stone temples could measure epochs with mathematical elegance. Imagine a system where time spiraled in cycles of 5,125 years, each day accounted for through intricate interlocking cycles of 20 and 13. This wasn't mere record-keeping, it was prophecy, agriculture, and theology woven into one. Priests used it to predict celestial events down to the hour, while farmers relied on its seasonal markers to plant maize when the rains arrived. Modern astronomers still marvel at its precision. The 2012 end date of one cycle sparked global fascination, though the Maya themselves saw it not as an apocalypse but as a reset, like the turning of an enormous celestial page. Half a world away, Stonehenge's hulking stones functioned as a prehistoric solar calculator. During solstices, sunlight pierces the monument's heart, aligning perfectly with the heel stone to mark the year's longest and shortest days. But here's what textbooks often miss. The builders likely used these alignments for more than agriculture. Recent excavations reveal cremated remains near the stones, hinting at rituals where the living communed with ancestors under the sun's sacred angles. Time wasn't abstract, it was a bridge between worlds where the solar cycle dictated when to harvest, when to mourn, even when to marry. Compare that to today's relentless tick of digital clocks, where minutes are commodified and productivity trumps rhythm. Ancient timekeepers understood something we've forgotten. Time flows, it breathes. The Incas divided their day not into rigid hours but by the sun's position over sacred peaks, while Aboriginal Australians read seasons through the blooming of desert peas or the arrival of migratory birds. These weren't primitive methods, they were symphonies of observation, attuned to Earth's subtle cues. Underlying these systems was a philosophy far richer than our modern race against deadlines. For the Maya, time was a divine current to be navigated, like a canoeist reading celestial rivers. The Hindu concept of yugas envisioned time as cyclical, with civilizations rising and falling in grand repetitions, a stark contrast to our linear march toward progress. Even the medieval European monastic bells, marking prayer hours, tied time to spiritual reflection rather than profit. Perhaps that's the true loss in our obsession with precision, not just how we measure time, but why. When ancient cultures watched shadows lengthen or stars pivot, they weren't just calculating, they were conversing with the universe. Their calendars weren't tools but living texts, reminding them that time, like the tides, was meant to be felt, not fought. There's a quiet rebellion brewing against the modern mantra of more, and its roots trace back to cultures that mastered the art of enough. Consider the Kung people of the Kalahari, who spent just 15 hours a week gathering food, leaving ample time for storytelling, music, and communal bonding. Anthropologist Richard Lee documented how their material possessions rarely exceeded what one could carry, yet their life satisfaction rivaled and often surpassed that of affluent Western societies. Similarly, Bhutan's Gross National Happiness Index measures prosperity not in GDP, but in forest cover, cultural preservation, and psychological well-being. These societies didn't just survive with less, they flourished, proving that abundance isn't about accumulation, but alignment with nature, community, and purpose. What's striking is how their sufficiency mindset shaped environmental ethics. The Kung hunted only what they needed, leaving animal populations to regenerate. Bhutan's constitution mandates that 60% of the country remain forested, a policy that's made it one of the world's few carbon-negative nations. Compare this to modern consumerism, where the average American discards 81 pounds of clothing yearly, and planned obsolescence fuels a cycle of endless replacement. Psychologist Tim Cass's studies reveal a paradox. The more we prioritize material wealth, the lower our well-being drops, a phenomenon he calls the high price of materialism. This raises an uncomfortable question. Could the key to solving our ecological and emotional crises lie in embracing limits? Indigenous philosophies often viewed the earth as a relative to honor, not a resource to exploit. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy's seventh-generation principle dictated that every decision weigh its impact 7 generations ahead, a stark contrast to quarterly profit cycles. Even the ancient Greek concept of eudaimonia, or flourishing, tied happiness to virtue and balance, not possessions. Today, movements like minimalism and degrowth echo these ideas, but they often miss the cultural scaffolding that made them sustainable. The Kung didn't just downsize. Their joy stemmed from deep social ties and a rhythm of life synced to nature's cadence. Bhutan's happiness model works because it's woven into education, governance, even urban planning, not marketed as a self-help trend. Perhaps the real lesson isn't just consuming less, but redefining what fills us. After all, the word wealth originally meant well-being, not wallet. These cultures remind us that true prosperity isn't about having everything. It's about needing very little and savoring what truly matters. Long before zero waste became a modern buzzword, indigenous cultures perfected the art of living without creating trash. Take the Inuit, who transformed every scrap of a hunted seal into something vital: meat for food, blubber for oil lamps, sinew for thread, even bones carved into tools or children's toys. Nothing was discarded because everything had purpose. Even the stomach became a waterproof pouch for storing food. This wasn't just resourcefulness, it was reverence, a philosophy that saw animals as partners in survival rather than commodities to exploit. Anthropologist Richard Nelson documented how Inuit hunters would offer prayers of gratitude after a kill, acknowledging the creature's sacrifice. Waste wasn't just impractical, it was unthinkable, a breach of the natural order. Half a world away, Japan's Edo period demonstrated how entire societies could thrive within closed-loop systems. From the 17th to 19th centuries, strict resource limits forced innovation. Farmers recycled human waste as fertilizer, paper makers repainted sliding doors to extend their use, and broken pottery was ground into glaze for new ceramics. The capital city, Edo, now Tokyo, became a model of urban sustainability, with recycling rates surpassing 80%. Historian Asby Brown's research reveals how merchants traded used goods much like modern thrift stores, while ash buyers collected fireplace remnants for reuse in ceramics and soap making. This wasn't scarcity, it was sophistication, proving that circular economies could foster both prosperity and ecological balance. Fast forward to today, where movements like precycling in Germany or Japan's Motenai, a term expressing regret over waste, are resurrecting these principles. Companies now mimic the Inuit by upcycling fish skins into leather or turning pineapple leaves into vegan textiles. But the real lesson lies deeper. These traditions thrived because they weren't just practical, they were sacred. The Ainu of northern Japan believed spirits dwelled in tools. Discarding them carelessly invited misfortune. Similarly, Native American tribes performed rituals to honor hunted animals, ensuring their spirits would return. This spiritual dimension might hold the key to reviving zero-waste ethics today. When the Maori speak of Kaishiakatanga, guardianship of the land, or Bhutanese monks tie environmental protection to Buddhist compassion, they remind us that sustainability isn't just about bins and recycling. It's about seeing the world as alive, interconnected, and worthy of reverence. Modern zero-waste advocates like B. Johnson stress this shift in mindset. It's not deprivation, it's liberation from clutter, both material and mental. Imagine if our eco-anxiety transformed into the deep-rooted contentment these cultures knew, not because they had more, but because they cherished what they had. The ecological potential is staggering. If global food systems mirrored Inuit efficiency, we could slash the 1/3 of produce currently wasted while feeding millions. Adopting Edo-style circularity could reduce landfill contributions by nearly 70%. But beyond statistics lies a profound invitation to live as if everything, from a seal's sinew to a ceramic shard, holds meaning. Because in the end, zero waste isn't just a practice. It's a pact with the planet, a recognition that nothing is ever truly disposable in a world where all things are connected. To the Maori of New Zealand, rivers weren't just sources of water, they were ancestors, living entities with rights and voices. In 2017, their Wanganui River became the first in the world to be granted legal personhood, a landmark decision rooted in centuries of indigenous belief. The river flows from the mountains to the sea, Elder Gerard Albert explained, and we are part of its journey, not its owners. This worldview, where forests breathe and mountains watch, wasn't unique to the Maori. The Druids of ancient Europe held oak groves as temples, believing every leaf pulsed with divine energy. Celtic laws even forbade cutting certain trees without rituals to honor their spirits. These weren't poetic metaphors, they were frameworks for survival, ensuring that humans acted as stewards, not conquerors, of the natural world. Now, contrast that with modern industrial logic, where rivers become sewers, forests become lumber quotas, and mountains are reduced to mineral deposits. The consequences are stark. Since 1970, wildlife populations have plummeted by nearly 70%, while indigenous territories, just 20% of Earth's land, shelter 80% of its remaining biodiversity. Ethnobotanist Wade Davis puts it bluntly: the cultures that saw nature as kin preserved it, those that saw it as a commodity destroyed it. Even the language reveals the divide, where corporate reports speak of resource extraction. The Quechua of the Andes speak of Pachamama, or Mother Earth, a living being to be nourished in return. But here's where it gets transformative. Scholars like Dr. Robin Wall Kimmerer, a Potawatomi scientist, argue that merging these worldviews could heal our ecological crises. Her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, highlights how indigenous practices like the Three Sisters planting method create abundance through reciprocity, not domination. Modern ecology is just catching up to what traditional knowledge has said for millennia. She notes, governments are slowly listening. Ecuador's constitution now grants rights to nature, inspired by indigenous cosmologies, while New Zealand's Te Ora Act recognizes a forest as a legal entity with protections akin to a citizen. This reverence extended to governance. The Iroquois Confederacy's Great Law of Peace required leaders to consider 7 generations ahead, a policy that today's politicians, shackled to election cycles, rarely emulate. In Bhutan, where gross national happiness guides policy, forest cover has grown to 70% while carbon emissions stay negligible. Compare that to nations chasing endless GDP growth, where short-term profits trump long-term survival. The Haida of the Pacific Northwest enforced strict hunting seasons not with police, but with stories, myths of famine that followed overharvesting, passed down to teach balance. The lesson isn't just about sustainability, it's about sovereignty. When the Amazon's Kayapo people block illegal loggers, they're not just defending trees, they're upholding a cosmology where humans and nature are equals. As climate scientist Johan Rockström warns, we've treated Earth like a business in liquidation when it's actually the only shareholder we have. Perhaps the path forward isn't newer technology, but older wisdom, a return to seeing the world not as a machine to fix, but as a living being to honor. After all, you don't poison your ancestors, you don't sell your siblings, and if rivers are people, then their rights, like ours, are non-negotiable. The Iroquois Confederacy didn't just practice democracy, they perfected a form of governance so inclusive, it made ancient Athens look authoritarian by comparison. At the heart of their system was the principle of unanimous consent. No decision could bind the people unless every clan, every nation, even every dissenting voice had been heard and acknowledged. Imagine a council fire where leaders debated not to win, but to weave together perspectives until a path forward emerged that all could walk. This wasn't mere voting, it was deep listening, a process the Haudenosaunee called the good mind, a state of collective clarity where ego dissolved into communal wisdom. Historian Bruce Johansson notes how sessions could last days, with women's councils holding veto power over war declarations, and children encouraged to observe so they might one day contribute. Compare that to modern politics, where majority rule often silences minorities, and tribal elder Oren Lyons captures the difference perfectly. We don't just count heads, we make sure every head counts. The brilliance of this model lay in its conflict resolution techniques. When disputes arose between nations like the Mohawk and Seneca, they didn't resort to coercion or force. Instead, they appointed clear-minded mediators, individuals with no stake in the outcome, to guide dialogues focused on restitution, not punishment. A murderer might be required to support the victim's family, healing the social fabric rather than severing it through exile or execution. Anthropologist William Fenton documented how these practices prevented feuds from spiraling, creating stability that lasted centuries. Fast forward to today, and you'll find echoes of this in restorative justice programs from New Zealand to Norway, where offenders face survivors to repair harm directly, a concept indigenous cultures institutionalized millennia ago. Modern cooperatives and indigenous-led conservation efforts now revive these principles with striking results. The Mondragon Corporation in Spain, one of the world's largest worker cooperatives, operates on consensus-based management, yielding productivity rates that outpace traditional firms. In Canada, the Haida Nation's unanimous decision-making governs the protection of Gwaii honas, a rainforest where logging permits require agreement from elders, youth, and even rival families. The result, a UNESCO biosphere reserve with thriving ecosystems and zero illegal deforestation, proof that consensus isn't just ethical, it's effective. But how did societies like the Iroquois cultivate such values in the first place? The answer lies in education systems that treated empathy as a core curriculum. From childhood, Haudenosaunee youth participated in Thanksgiving addresses, daily recitations that instilled gratitude for everything from flowing streams to buzzing insects. Games weren't about competition but cooperation, like the Peach Stone Dice game, where players strategized together to reach a shared goal. Even discipline took the form of storytelling. A child who strayed might hear a tale about the consequences of selfishness, internalizing lessons through narrative rather than punishment. This holistic approach stands in stark contrast to modern education's focus on individual achievement. Psychologist Angela Duckworth's research on grit aligns with indigenous pedagogy, showing that resilience flourishes in communal contexts, not isolation. The Cherokee's beloved women weren't just leaders, they were mentors who taught generations to weigh decisions by their impact on the seventh generation to come. In an era where schools prioritize standardized test scores over emotional intelligence, these ancient models offer a radical alternative: education as the art of sustaining relationships with each other, and with the living world. Perhaps the most profound lesson lies in what these systems didn't do. They didn't rush. They didn't reduce complex issues to binary choices. They understood that true consensus isn't about speed but depth, the kind of deliberation that leaves no one behind. As climate summits stumble over majority votes and corporate boards prioritize shareholder profits, the quiet legacy of these tribes whispers a question. What if the most advanced form of governance isn't about ruling at all, but about learning to listen, truly listen, until every voice finds its place in the chorus? In the hushed snowfields of the Arctic, an Inuit child doesn't learn to hunt by memorizing textbooks or sitting through lectures. Instead, they grip a miniature harpoon, its shaft carved to fit their small hands, and watch as their father demonstrates how to read the subtle cracks in the ice or the way a seal's breath creates tiny bubbles on the frozen surface. This is education in its purest form, knowledge passed not through abstract theories, but through hands, eyes, and lived experience. By the time that child takes their first solo hunt, every muscle remembers the motions, every sense is attuned to the environment, because learning wasn't separate from doing, it was inseparable. This apprenticeship model once thrived across cultures. Medieval European guilds operated similarly, where a young blacksmith wouldn't just study metallurgy in a classroom, but would spend years as an apprentice, blowing bellows and hammering red-hot metal beside a master. The guild's motto, learning by the hand and the eye, recognized that true mastery required more than facts. It demanded embodied knowledge. A weaver's apprentice didn't just memorize thread counts. Their fingers learned the rhythm of the loom through repetition, their mistakes corrected not with grades but with the patient guidance of someone who'd woven 1,000 tapestries. Historian Stephen Epstein notes that guilds produced artisans whose skills rivaled modern engineers, despite lacking formal degrees, proof that expertise isn't just stored in the mind, but in the hands. Now contrast that with today's education systems, where students spend hours absorbing information they'll rarely apply. A high school chemistry class might balance equations on paper, but never step into a lab, while history lessons reduce epic civilizations to multiple-choice questions. Psychologist David Kolb's research on experiential learning reveals a stark gap. Retention rates soar when students actively engage with material, yet most classrooms still prioritize passive absorption. It's as if we've inverted the natural order, treating the body as an afterthought to the brain. Yet hope glimmers in places like Finland, where recent reforms have dismantled traditional subject silos in favor of phenomenon-based learning. Students might study climate change by calculating carbon footprints in math, debating policy in social studies, and building solar ovens in shop class, all in one interdisciplinary project. The results: higher engagement, deeper understanding, and skills that don't vanish after final exams. Finnish educators describe it as bringing apprenticeship thinking into the digital age, proving that even modern systems can reconnect knowing with doing. But the most overlooked element of these ancient models was the role of play. Inuit children practiced hunting with games, tossing weighted mittens to simulate harpoon throws. Medieval apprentices competed in craft guild contests, carving their best work under time limits just for the joy of it. Anthropologist David Lancy found that in cultures where children learn through observation and imitation, play isn't separate from education, it's the training ground. A Maasai boy herding toy livestock internalizes cattle management. A Balinese girl weaving palm fronds into dolls masters the basics of intricate temple offerings. This reveals a profound truth these cultures understood. Creativity isn't the opposite of rigor, it's the pathway to mastery. Neurologically, play triggers dopamine and oxytocin, chemicals that enhance memory and social bonding. When learning feels like discovery rather than duty, skills stick. Modern Montessori and Reggio Emilia schools embrace this, but mainstream education still treats play as frivolous, something to outgrow. Yet the evidence mounts. Surgeons who played video games as teens make fewer errors in laparoscopic procedures, and engineers who tinkered with childhood toys out-innovate their peers. Perhaps the real genius of apprenticeship wasn't just the transfer of skills, but the cultivation of curiosity. A guild master didn't just demand precision, they nurtured the apprentice's pride in a perfectly dovetailed joint. An Inuit hunter didn't just teach survival, they instilled awe for the patterns of wind and ice. In our rush to standardize education, we've severed this emotional connection, the joy of making, the thrill of problem solving. The challenge now isn't just to reintroduce hands-on learning, but to reignite the spark that turns practice into passion. After all, the greatest craftsmen weren't just trained, they were inspired. In the red dust of the Australian outback, Aboriginal children didn't just hear stories, they danced them. Every leap and shuffle traced the paths of ancestral beings, mapping waterholes and mountain ranges into muscle memory. These weren't mere performances, they were living lessons in geography, history, and survival. Songlines, the intricate oral maps woven into dances and chants, could guide a traveler hundreds of miles across featureless desert. Anthropologist Bruce Chatwin marveled at how a single ceremony might encode the migratory routes of emus or the flowering cycles of bush tomatoes, turning rhythm and movement into an encyclopedia of the land. Developmental psychologists now recognize what these cultures knew instinctively. When knowledge is embodied through play, it sticks. The same neural pathways that light up during music and dance also govern spatial reasoning and long-term memory, explaining why songline practitioners could recall details with GPS-like precision after a single participatory performance. Vikings, meanwhile, sharpened their strategic minds not with drills, but with Age Ceremonies, a board game so revered, warriors were often buried with their pieces. Archaeologists find these carved stone boards from Scandinavia to Ireland, their checkered patterns mirroring battlefield tactics. Players maneuvered a king piece to safety while opponents closed in, a dynamic that mirrored real raids where cunning outweighed brute force. Cognitive scientist Dr. Roberta Michnik-Golinkoff notes how such games build executive function, the mental flexibility to plan, adapt, and anticipate consequences. Viking children didn't just learn warfare through lectures, they internalized it through the thrill of competition, their brains forging connections between playful choices and real-world outcomes. But play wasn't just about skill building, it was social glue. The Tsimane people of the Amazon hold wrestling matches where laughter dissolves tensions between rival villages, while the San of Southern Africa use rhythmic clapping games to synchronize group morale before hunts. Ethnomusicologist Ellen DeSanayak identifies these activities as biocultural necessities, rituals that release oxytocin and dopamine, chemicals that foster trust and cooperation. In a world without contracts or courts, play became the original social contract, teaching fairness and reciprocity long before legal codes existed. Art, too, was far more than decoration. The intricate dot paintings of Aboriginal elders weren't just aesthetic, they layered creation myths with practical knowledge. A single artwork might depict water sources hidden to outsiders, or the seasonal movements of animals, a visual library accessible only to those trained in its symbols. Similarly, Norse runestones carved with seemingly decorative knots often encoded navigational cues for sailors, their interlacing patterns mirroring ocean currents. Archaeologist Dr. Lot Hediger argues that Viking art was cognitive scaffolding, embedding complex information in forms that engaged both emotion and intellect. This fusion of play, art, and utility reveals a radical truth. these societies didn't separate learning from living. A Maori child carving a fishing hook learned physics through the flecks of wood, theology through the chants sung while working, and ethics through the elders' reminder to take only what the sea could spare. Modern research now confirms that multisensory learning, where hands, ears, and heart engage alongside the mind, boosts retention by up to 75%. Yet we've walled off play into recess and art into elective courses, as if creativity were garnish rather than the main dish. Perhaps that's why Indigenous games persist where textbooks fade. Inuit grandmothers still teach storytelling through string figures, their looping threads illustrating tales of seal hunts and blizzards. The Cherokee continue their stickball matches, where every dodge and pass reinforces clan unity. These traditions endure not because they're quaint, but because they work transmitting wisdom across generations in ways that feel less like instruction and more like joy. In our quest for efficiency, we've stripped education of its laughter, its music, its messiness. These cultures remind us that the deepest knowledge often hides in the places we've forgotten to play. Deep in the caves of Lascaux, where torchlight flickers against walls older than written history, a herd of painted horses gallops across stone, not just as art but as an ancient library. The spots on their backs aren't random. Researchers like Dr. Michael Rappingluke discovered they mirror star clusters like the Pleiades, suggesting these images served as celestial calendars tracking mating seasons or migrations. Meanwhile, in the American Southwest, Navajo healers still pour colored sands into intricate mandalas, each curve and hue representing a specific healing prayer or anatomical detail. These weren't mere decorations, they were diagnostic tools, destroyed after use because the act of creation itself held the medicine. The Pacific Northwest's towering totem poles tell a similar story. To the untrained eye, they're carved with animals and spirits, but to the Tlingit and Haida peoples, each figure is a chapter in a family's history. A bear might signify an ancestor's bravery, while a raven's outstretched wings could map territorial boundaries. Anthropologist Marius Barbo documented how these poles functioned as legal documents, their grooves and colors encoding inheritance, rights, or treaty agreements long before parchment existed. Even the negative space between figures held meaning, a visual language where silence spoke as loudly as form. Then there are the Celtic knots, looping endlessly without beginning or end. Medieval monks wove these patterns into illuminated manuscripts not just for beauty, but as theological puzzles. The Book of Kells spirals, for instance, mirror the cyclical Celtic view of time, where life, death, and rebirth intertwined like the strands themselves. Archaeologist Miranda Aldhouse Green notes how these designs often hid coded messages. A triple spiral might represent the triple goddess, while interlaced animals signaled clan alliances. Languages, too, became living galleries of worldview. The Inuit have dozens of words for snow, each describing its texture, density, or danger, a lexicon born from survival necessity. The Gugu Yimithirr people of Australia don't use left or right. They navigate by cardinal directions, saying "my north hand" or "the cup is southwest." Linguist John Haviland found this forces speakers to maintain constant spatial awareness, turning every conversation into a mental map. Similarly, the Tuvan language of Siberia assigns verbs based on whether an action moves toward or away from a river, embedding geography into grammar. What unites these systems is their multidimensionality. A single Navajo sand painting could simultaneously depict a myth, a medical chart, and a meditation guide. The Lascaux artists didn't just paint animals, they painted relationships between earth and sky. In an age where we've outsourced memory to hard drives, These traditions remind us that knowledge isn't just stored, it's felt, danced, sung, and woven into the very fabric of daily life. They challenge our assumption that literacy began with alphabets, offering instead a vision where every stroke, knot, or grain of sand held volumes. The Hopi language doesn't have words for past, present, or future. Instead, verbs transform to reveal whether an event is ongoing, completed, or expected, a subtle but seismic shift in how time is experienced. Linguist Benjamin Lee Horff, who studied the Hopi in the 1930s, argued that this structure created a worldview where time wasn't a straight line but a continuous flow, like a river without banks. For the Hopi, planting corn wasn't an action bound to a calendar date. It was part of a cyclical dance between earth and sky, where readiness mattered more than clocks. This idea that language molds thought became known as the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, sparking debates that still ripple through neuroscience labs today. Critics point out that Inuit languages don't actually have hundreds of unique words for snow, as popularly claimed, but rather a handful of root words that combine to describe specific conditions, falling snow versus drifting snow. Yet even this nuance reveals something profound. When survival hinges on reading frozen landscapes, language becomes a finely tuned survival tool. Modern research adds layers to this puzzle. At Stanford, psychologist Lera Boroditsky found that Russian speakers, who divide the color spectrum differently from English speakers, could distinguish shades of blue faster because their language treats light and dark blue as separate categories. Meanwhile, the Piraha people of the Amazon, whose language lacks numbers beyond 1, 2, and many, struggle with basic arithmetic, not because they're incapable, but because their culture prioritizes immediacy over abstraction. These cases don't prove language dictates thought, but they show it shapes attention, like a spotlight highlighting certain details while leaving others in shadow. Trade, however, blurred these linguistic boundaries, weaving distant worldviews into unexpected dialogues. Along the Silk Road, Arabic numerals originally from India spread west because they made calculations easier than Roman numerals. The word orange traveled from Sanskrit to Persian to Arabic before reaching Europe, its journey mirroring the fruit's own migration along spice routes. Even the Inuits' intricate snow terms found echoes in Sami languages as reindeer herders exchanged knowledge with Arctic neighbors. Commerce didn't just move goods, it stirred ideas, proving that while language might shape perception, connection could reshape language. The most fascinating twist: some languages thrive by borrowing. English, a magpie of vocabulary, absorbed tsunami from Japanese and ketchup from Chinese, each word carrying a fragment of its origin culture's perspective. This linguistic alchemy suggests that diversity isn't a barrier, it's a bridge. When a Moroccan trader used the Berber word tifainog to describe writing, or a Venetian merchant adopted the Turkish divan for a council chamber, they weren't just swapping terms. They were stitching together a shared understanding, one syllable at a time. Long before container ships and free trade agreements, the world was already woven together by invisible threads of exchange, threads that carried not just goods but ideas, art, and even peace. Take obsidian, the volcanic glass so prized by ancient Mesopotamians that it traveled over 1,000 miles from its sources in Anatolia and Armenia. Archaeologists find these razor-sharp tools in ruins as far apart as Jericho and Catalhoyuk, proving that even 8,000 years ago, people understood the value of trading rather than raiding. What's remarkable isn't just the distance these artifacts covered, but the relationships they represent. Villagers didn't just swap stones, they exchanged technologies, like the revolutionary moment when someone realized obsidian could be knapped into blades sharper than modern surgical steel. But the real masters of early globalization were the Lapita people of the Pacific, whose intricate pottery shards trace a maritime highway stretching from New Guinea to Tonga. Unlike later empires that conquered by the sword, the Lapita expanded through kinship and gift-giving. A single clay pot might travel hundreds of miles as part of a ceremonial exchange, binding distant islands into a web of mutual obligation. Anthropologist Patrick Kirch describes how these networks functioned like ancient social media. Each traded shell, necklace, or obsidian adze wasn't just currency, but a status update, a wedding announcement, even a peace treaty. Then there's the Silk Road's forgotten ancestor, the Jade Road of Central Asia. Centuries before silk draped Roman shoulders, nephrite jade was crossing deserts on the backs of Bactrian camels, linking Chinese emperors to Persian artisans. The Tarim mummies, fair-haired Caucasians buried in Chinese silk, tell a story of multicultural hubs where Sogdian merchants acted as go-betweens, brokering deals between empires that barely knew each other's languages. Diplomacy here wasn't conducted in palaces, but in caravanserais, where shared meals and storytelling smoothed over conflicts long before swords were drawn. Conflict resolution in these networks often looked nothing like modern warfare. The Kula Ring of Melanesia, a ceremonial exchange system documented by Bronislaw Malinowski, required rivals to trade shell armbands and necklaces in opposite directions across a vast archipelago. The catch: you couldn't keep what you received, the magic lay in passing it on. This created a paradox where enemies became partners, bound by a cycle of reciprocity that made raiding unthinkable. Similarly, the Chaco Canyon culture of the American Southwest built great houses not for defense, but as neutral meeting grounds where tribes gathered to trade turquoise for macaw feathers from Mexico. Warfare was rare because the cost of disrupting trade outweighed any fleeting victory. These systems thrived on something modern commerce often lacks: sacred trust. A Polynesian navigator might spend months guiding a canoe laden with breadfruit seedlings to a distant island, knowing repayment would come years later when his own village needed taro. The Yapese of Micronesia took this further, using massive stone discs as currency, stones too heavy to move, but whose ownership changed hands through oral agreements honored across generations. In a world without contracts, reputation was everything, and a broken promise could exile your descendants from the trade network forever. The lesson hidden in these ancient exchanges isn't just about economics, it's about entanglement. When cultures intertwine their fates through shared need, conquest becomes irrational. The obsidian trader from Anatolia didn't see the Syrian village as a target, he saw them as customers. The Lapita potter knew her craft might grace a chief's feast in Fiji, making war as unthinkable as burning your own warehouse. Perhaps that's why the most enduring trade routes flourished in places where no single empire could dominate, because true exchange requires equality, not empire. As we navigate our own age of tariffs and sanctions, these forgotten networks whisper an alternative: prosperity built not on walls but on open hands. The San people of the Kalahari have a radical approach to conflict resolution, one that doesn't involve prisons, fines, or even raised voices. When tensions flare, they gather in what anthropologists call talking circles, where disputants sit facing each other, passing a sacred stick. The rule: only the person holding the stick may speak, and they must continue speaking until every last grievance has been poured out. There are no interruptions, no rebuttals, just deep listening, often for hours or even days, until the emotional storm passes and understanding emerges. Ethnographer Richard Borshay Lee observed how these circles could dissolve feuds that might spark violence elsewhere, simply by giving space for every perspective to be heard. The goal wasn't to determine who was right, but to restore harmony to the group, because in a hunter-gatherer society where survival depends on cooperation, conflict isn't just personal, it's existential. Half a world away, the Maori of New Zealand developed a parallel system called Wakapakare, where wrongdoing was addressed not through punishment but through restoration. A thief might be required to carve a ceremonial pole for the victim's family, transforming shame into artistry. Warriors who injured rivals in battle would often tend their wounds, binding the injured and the injurer in a new relationship of obligation. Historian Angela Ballara notes how these practices embedded accountability into community bonds, making alienation far costlier than restitution. Modern restorative justice programs in New Zealand prisons now draw from this tradition, with offenders meeting victims face to face, a method that slashed reoffending rates by nearly 20% compared to conventional incarceration. Compare this to the modern world's default setting, militarization. The United States spends more on defense than the next 10 nations combined, while global arms sales top $2 trillion annually. Peace researcher Dr. Johan Galtung argues that this reflects a fundamental mismatch. We've industrialized warfare, but kept conflict resolution artisanally small scale. Tribal models work because they treat violence as a systemic failure, he explains, while states often treat it as a tool. The contrast couldn't be starker. Where the San invest time in dialogue, modern nations invest in drones. Where the Maori prioritize healing, industrial justice prioritizes isolation. Yet the real surprise lies in how these so-called primitive societies paired peacekeeping with technological brilliance. The San's tracking skills, honed over millennia of non-violent hunting, are now studied by search and rescue teams for their ability to read minute disturbances in soil or foliage. The Maori's pataka storehouses, designed to redistribute food during shortages, inspired modern food bank logistics with their intricate systems of reciprocity. Even their war canoes, masterpieces of hydrodynamic engineering, were repurposed for trade once conflicts ended, their sleek designs later influencing competitive rowing shells. This duality, fierce innovation coupled with profound conflict aversion, challenges our assumptions about progress. We assume technology marches hand in hand with domination, yet these cultures remind us that the most enduring advances often spring from collaboration. The talking stick and the storehouse, the restorative circle and the seafaring vessel, these weren't contradictions but two sides of the same coin. A coin we might do well to spend more thoughtfully today. The Romans built harbors that have withstood 2,000 years of crashing waves, while our modern concrete crumbles in decades. Their secret, a recipe so durable it sparked a scientific gold rush: volcanic ash, lime, and seawater, mixing to form a mineral called aluminum tobamorite. When cracks form, this mineral reacts with moisture to create new crystals, effectively healing itself. Engineers like Dr. Marie Jackson at the University of Utah are now racing to reverse engineer this ancient marvel, hoping to revolutionize seawalls and nuclear waste storage. Yet for centuries, the formula was lost, buried under the collapse of an empire too vast to sustain its own brilliance. Equally enigmatic is Greek fire, the Byzantine Empire's ultimate naval weapon. Historical accounts describe a liquid flame that clung to ships and burned even on water, unleashed through bronze tubes mounted on warships. Emperor Constantine Roman IV used it to repel Arab invasions in the 7th century, saving Constantinople from conquest. The exact composition remains a mystery, though modern theories suggest a volatile mix of pine resin, quicklime, and naphtha, a crude oil derivative. The Byzantines guarded the secret so fiercely that when their last alchemist died without passing it on, the knowledge vanished forever. Today, military historians and pyrotechnics experts still debate whether any recreation truly matches the original's terrifying effectiveness. Then there's Zhang Heng's seismoscope, a bronze urn crafted in 2nd century China that could detect earthquakes hundreds of miles away. 8 dragons coiled around its surface, each holding a metal ball above a corresponding toad's mouth. When tremors struck, a pendulum inside would tilt, dropping a ball to indicate the quake's direction. In one famous incident, it alerted the emperor to a distant quake no one in the capital had felt, only for messengers to later confirm its accuracy. Modern engineers have recreated versions using mercury or inertia principles, but none match the elegance of the original, which required no electricity or moving parts beyond its delicate balance. What's haunting isn't just that these technologies disappeared, but why. Roman concrete's recipe faded as centralized knowledge gave way to medieval fragmentation. Greek fire died with its keepers because secrecy trumped preservation. Zhang Heng's seismoscope was so far ahead of its time that later dynasties dismissed it as superstition until European science rediscovered seismology centuries later. Each loss reflects a pattern. Progress isn't inevitable. Civilizations forget as much as they learn, especially when knowledge is hoarded or disbelieved. Yet perhaps the most fascinating layer is how myth filled these gaps. The Greeks explained earthquakes with Poseidon's trident striking the earth, while the Norse blamed Loki's writhings in his chains. Volcanoes became Hephaestus' forge or Peel's wrath in Hawaiian lore. These weren't just stories, they were frameworks to make the inexplicable feel navigable. When Zhang Heng's device faded into legend, it re-emerged in folklore as a dragon jar. Its scientific precision blurred into mystical symbolism. Now, as scientists mine ancient texts for lost innovations, they're finding that the line between myth and technology was often thinner than we assumed. The sky iron used in Tibetan Buddhist statues, now believed to be meteoric metal, its celestial origin giving it spiritual significance. The ever-burning lamps in Egyptian tombs. Possibly fueled by naphtha or phosphorus, their longevity magnified by time into legend. These weren't primitive fantasies, they were attempts to explain real phenomena with the tools at hand. In a world without peer-reviewed journals, the language of gods and spirits became the code to transmit truths too complex for plain speech. So the next time you hear an ancient myth, listen closely. It might not just be a story, it could be a blueprint waiting to be decoded. From the icy peaks of the Andes to the floodplains of Mesopotamia, ancient myths didn't just entertain, they encoded geological truths with startling precision. Take the ubiquitous flood stories found in over 200 cultures worldwide. The Sumerian epic of Gilgamesh describes torrents so violent, even the gods cowered, while the Kayich Maya's Popol Vuh tells of a deluge that wiped out a wooden race of humans. Modern geologists like Dr. William Ryan connect these narratives to the catastrophic meltwater pulses at the end of the last ice age, when rising seas swallowed coastal settlements at rates visible within a single lifetime. Core samples from the Black Sea reveal a sudden inundation around 7,600 years ago, precisely when oral traditions in the region began warning of divine retribution through water. These weren't mere fantasies, they were survival logs passed down to prepare descendants for environmental shifts we'd only quantify millennia later with satellite data. Volcanoes, too, left their fiery fingerprints on mythology. The Aztec legend of the fifth sun describes a world consumed by volcanic ash, mirroring the eruption of Zittel volcano that buried Cuicuilco around 2,000 years ago. Hawaiian chants speak of Peel's battles with her sister Namakekahai, their clashes manifesting as lava meeting ocean, a poetic yet accurate depiction of phreatomagmatic explosions. Even Plato's tale of Atlantis sinking may reference the thorough eruption around 1600 BCE, which triggered tsunamis reaching as far as Egypt. What's remarkable isn't just the observational accuracy, but the methodology. These cultures treated cataclysms not as random events, but as interconnected cycles, much like modern Earth systems science. The real genius emerges in how these stories frame destruction as renewal. The Norse Ragnarok doesn't end with annihilation, it culminates in a reborn world where surviving gods till fertile soil from the ashes. Similarly, Aboriginal Australian Dreamtime stories describe ancestral beings shaping landscapes through both creation and catastrophe, teaching that balance requires occasional upheaval. Modern ecology confirms this intuition. Forest fires clear space for new growth, while floods deposit nutrient-rich silt. These myths grasped a truth we often forget. Chaos and creation are partners, not opposites. Now consider celestial myths. The Dogon people of Mali recount how the star Sirius B, a white dwarf invisible without telescopes, was once a fiery giant that collapsed under its own weight. Compare this to astrophysics. White dwarfs indeed form when stars exhaust their nuclear fuel and implode. Coincidence, perhaps, but when multiple cultures independently describe astronomical phenomena like supernova or eclipses with uncanny detail, it suggests something deeper than luck. The Chinese dragon bones, oracle bones etched with eclipse records prove they decoded the Saros cycle, predicting lunar events centuries before Newton's calculus. What modern science often dismisses as superstition was in fact an early form of systems thinking. The Hindu concept of pralaya, periodic cosmic dissolution, aligns with modern cosmology's cyclical universe theories. The Hopi prophecy of Blue Star Kachina, foretelling a celestial event bringing purification, finds eerie resonance in hypotheses about a future close pass by a blue giant star. These parallels reveal a shared human impulse to seek patterns in chaos, whether through star lore or supercomputer models. Yet the true power of these narratives lies in their emotional resonance. Where science might state sea levels rose 200 feet, the Haida story of Raven coaxing survivors into a giant clam shell makes the trauma survivable, even meaningful. Both convey truth, but one does so with a grip on the heart that raw data can't match. This union of empirical observation and poetic wisdom might be antiquity's greatest gift, not just knowledge of how the world works, but why its rhythms matter to those who call it home. In Mexico, when night falls on November 1st, cemeteries ignite with candlelight as families gather to welcome back the souls of their loved ones. This is Dia de los Muertos, not a mourning ritual, but a riotous celebration where death wears a grin as bright as sugar skulls and marigold petals guide spirits home. Psychologists like Dr. Claudia Reyes Cruz note how this tradition transforms grief into communal joy. By dressing skeletons in vibrant clothes and sharing their favorite foods, the living reframe loss as a temporary separation rather than an ending. Similar practices appear across cultures. The ancient Egyptians filled tombs with board games and beer, ensuring the deceased had entertainment for eternity, while Tibetan Buddhists create intricate sand mandalas only to sweep them away, teaching impermanence through beauty's fleeting nature. These rituals share a startling insight. Cultures that befriended death often weathered catastrophe with remarkable resilience. When Mount Vesuvius buried Pompeii, survivors didn't abandon the city. They tunneled back to retrieve bodies, holding funeral rites amid the rubble. Forensic archaeologist Dr. Estelle Laser found evidence of these ceremonies in the ash, where bones were carefully arranged with coins for the underworld's ferrymen. Contrast this with modern societies that often sanitize death, hiding it behind hospital curtains and euphemisms. Anthropologist Dr. Kelly Swazi argues that our discomfort with mortality leaves us psychologically unprepared for collective trauma, while cultures like Bali's Ungaban cremation ceremonies, where towering bamboo structures carry the departed to the afterlife in fiery processions, integrate loss into life's rhythm. The genius of these traditions lies in their duality. Ghana's fantasy coffins shaped like fish for fishermen or cars for businessmen mock death's solemnity while honoring individual passions. Medieval Europe's Danse Macabre frescoes showed skeletons waltzing with kings and peasants alike, a pointed reminder that mortality was the ultimate democratizer. Even the Victorian era's post-mortem photography, often misunderstood as morbid, served as keepsakes for families who'd lost children to diseases we now prevent with vaccines. These weren't acts of denial but defiance, a way to stare into the abyss and laugh, or at least smile through tears. When disasters struck, these frameworks became lifelines. After the 1755 Lisbon earthquake, survivors held makeshift All Saints' Day processions amid ruins, using familiar rituals to anchor shattered minds. Japan's Obon Festival, where lanterns float down rivers to guide ancestral spirits, gained new poignance after the 2011 tsunami, as mourners added thousands of lights for unnamed victims. Sociologist Dr. Hiroshi Ishikawa observed how these acts helped communities process loss collectively, preventing the isolation that often follows modern tragedies. Perhaps the most profound lesson comes from the Tana Toraja of Indonesia, who keep deceased relatives at home for months or years, treating them as sick until funds are saved for elaborate funerals. During this liminal period, families share meals with the embalmed body, updating them on village gossip. When floods or famines hit, this ongoing dialogue with the dead fostered a mindset that no one was truly gone. Their wisdom remained woven into daily life. In our era of climate crises and pandemics, these ancient blueprints offer more than comfort. They provide a roadmap for resilience, proving that societies thrive not by avoiding grief, but by transforming it into art, connection, and even joy. The towering cliff dwellings of the Anasazi in the American Southwest tell a silent story of resilience and warning. Around 800 years ago, these ancestral pueblones faced a megat drought so severe it reshaped entire societies. Instead of clinging to failing farms in the arid lowlands, they retreated to sheer canyon walls, building intricate stone villages like Mesa Verde's Cliff Palace. Here's the twist: their survival wasn't about brute force against nature, but radical adaptation. Archaeologists like Dr. Timothy Kohler found evidence they shifted from corn to drought-resistant prickly pear and jackrabbits, while their masonry trapped precious moisture from rare rains. Modern dendrochronology, the study of tree rings, reveals these droughts lasted decades. Yet the Anasazi endured by decentralizing into smaller, mobile bands when needed. Half a world away, Rapa Nui's towering moai statues stand as stark sentinels of ecological reckoning. For centuries, the islanders thrived, carving and transporting these colossal figures across lush palm forests. Then pollen samples tell us the trees vanished over-harvested for canoes and rollers. With no wood to build fishing boats, soil erosion from deforestation choked crops, and by the time Europeans arrived, the civilization had fractured. But recent research flips the old ecocide narrative. Archaeologists Terry Hunt and Carl Lipo argue the islanders didn't passively collapse, they innovated. Stone mulch gardens called manavai boosted soil fertility, while rock-lined pits captured dew for irrigation. Their population didn't vanish, it adapted to harsh new limits with startling creativity. These stories whisper urgent lessons for our own climate crossroads. Like the Anasazi, California now experiments with desert-friendly crops like agave, once dismissed as tequila plants, while Arizona's Tohono O'odham Nation revives ancient runoff farming. Meanwhile, Rapa Nui's rock gardens inspire dryland farming techniques from Africa to Australia, proving even stripped ecosystems can rebound with clever intervention. The common thread: these cultures didn't just survive, they transformed crisis into reinvention. Today's scientists are listening. NASA uses satellite imaging to rediscover lost Anasazi water channels, while permaculturists mimic Rapa Nui's stone gardens to combat desertification. The real revelation isn't just their techniques, but their mindset, viewing scarcity not as an ending, but a call to reimagine what's possible. After all, the descendants of these so-called collapsed civilizations are still here, proof that adaptation isn't about avoiding disaster, but outsmarting it. Across the globe, a quiet revolution is unfolding as modern innovators rediscover that the solutions to our most pressing challenges might be hidden in plain sight, woven into the very traditions we once dismissed as obsolete. Take permaculture, a design system that's essentially the Three Sisters method scaled up for the 21st century. Pioneers like Bill Mollison and David Holmgren didn't invent these principles. They observed Aboriginal fire stick farming and Balinese water temples, then synthesized them into a blueprint for sustainable agriculture. Today, permaculture farms from Vermont to Vietnam are proving that polycultures mimicking natural ecosystems can yield more nutritious food with less water and zero pesticides. At Zaytuna Farm in Australia, a single acre integrates fruit trees, grazing geese, and compost systems so efficient they've reversed soil degradation in just 5 years. Meanwhile, Scandinavia's forest schools are resurrecting the Inuit model of embodied learning, trading classroom walls for pine canopies. Children in Denmark spend 80% of their school days outdoors, building shelters like the Indigenous Sami, identifying edible plants like the Cherokee, and navigating by natural landmarks like Polynesian wayfinders. The results: studies show forest school students outperform peers in creativity, resilience, and even standardized test scores. We're not teaching kids about nature, says educator Anders Shapansky. We're letting nature teach them. Indigenous communities themselves are leading the charge in conservation, blending ancestral knowledge with cutting-edge science. In the Amazon, the Kayapo people use drones to monitor illegal logging, pairing satellite imagery with their intimate understanding of forest rhythms. The result: their territory boasts deforestation rates 80% lower than surrounding areas. Similarly, the Maori-led Te Yowara initiative in New Zealand grants legal personhood to forests, merging traditional reverence for nature with modern environmental law. "You don't protect what you don't love," explains Ho elder Tamati Kruger, and you don't love what you don't know, yet these revivals face stubborn misconceptions. Critics dismiss permaculture as hippie farming, ignoring its roots in rigorous observation, like how the Milpa cycle of Mesoamerica sustained soils for millennia without synthetic inputs. Others argue forest schools lack academic rigor, oblivious to studies showing outdoor learners develop superior problem-solving skills. Even indigenous conservation gets romanticized as noble savage idealism rather than recognized as the sophisticated land management it is. The truth: these aren't nostalgic throwbacks but evolved adaptations, ancient wisdom filtered through the lens of modern challenges. The pushback often reveals a deeper bias, the myth that progress must mean abandoning the past. When Masanobu Fukuoka pioneered do-nothing farming in Japan, eschewing plows and chemicals in favor of natural cycles, skeptics called it regression. Yet his yields rivaled industrial farms while restoring biodiversity. Likewise, when the Winnemem Wintu tribe reintroduced traditional fire practices to California's drought-stricken valleys, They didn't just reduce wildfires, they revived dormant seed banks, bringing back native plants unseen for generations. What unites these modern practitioners isn't blind adherence to tradition, but the recognition that some truths are timeless. Whether it's a German architect designing buildings cooled by Persian wind catchers or a Kenyan women's group reviving the Sabaki River with ancient terracing techniques, the pattern is clear. The future belongs to those who listen to the whispers of the past. And as climate chaos escalates, those whispers are becoming a roar, a reminder that survival has always been less about conquering nature than learning its rhythms. The word primitive carries a weight of misconception, as if these cultures were merely stumbling toward progress instead of forging their own paths of brilliance. Consider this: while medieval Europe bled patients with leeches, the ancient Egyptians were performing cataract surgery with finely honed bronze tools. Papyrus scrolls from 2,500 years ago detail procedures for setting broken bones and even mention the pulse's connection to the heart, a fact Western medicine wouldn't confirm until the 17th century. Or take the Aztecs, who developed a botanical garden so vast it dwarfed Europe's finest, cultivating over 3,000 medicinal plants with uses modern labs are only now verifying. Their painkilling salve, made from passion flower and willow bark, contained compounds eerily similar to aspirin. These weren't lucky guesses. They were the fruits of meticulous observation and experimentation, passed down through generations with the precision of any scientific journal. Astronomy offers another stark rebuttal to the backward stereotype. While Galileo faced house arrest for defending heliocentrism, Polynesian navigators were charting the Pacific's expanse using star compasses etched into memory, not parchment. The Dogon people's knowledge of Sirius B, a dwarf star invisible without telescopes, predates its discovery by Western astronomers by centuries. Even the humble quipu, the Inca's knotted string accounting system, encoded data so efficiently some scholars argue it rivaled early computers in complexity. These advancements didn't emerge in isolation. They were the products of societies that valued empirical knowledge just as deeply as we do. They simply wore it differently, woven into stories, dances, and daily rituals rather than white papers. Yet for all their ingenuity, these traditions now face a modern threat: cultural appropriation. There's a painful irony in seeing corporations patent indigenous remedies like turmeric or hudia, turning communal knowledge into private profit without consent or compensation. When sacred symbols become fashion trends, Navajo patterns on cheap blankets, Maori tattoos inked by tourists unaware of their lineage, the harm isn't just economic, it's spiritual. Ethnobotanist Dr. Vandana Shiva puts it bluntly: plundering traditional knowledge while erasing its origins isn't innovation, it's intellectual colonialism. The line between appreciation and appropriation hinges on respect, crediting sources, supporting indigenous-led initiatives, and recognizing that some knowledge isn't meant for mass consumption. So how do we engage without exploiting? Start by amplifying indigenous voices directly. Seek out books by native scholars like Robin Wall Kimmerer or documentaries produced by First Nations filmmakers. Support fair trade cooperatives that pay artisans fairly rather than knockoffs that dilute cultural significance. And when encountering ancient wisdom, whether it's forest bathing techniques from Japan or Ayurvedic nutrition, ask not just "how can I use this?" but "what can I give back?" Because true respect doesn't take, it reciprocates, ensuring these living traditions thrive on their own terms. After all, the measure of progress isn't how much we borrow from the past, but how faithfully we honor its keepers. The beauty of ancient wisdom lies not just in its knowledge, but in the living cultures that carry it forward, which is why engaging with these traditions demands more than curiosity. It requires responsibility. Imagine stumbling upon a medicinal plant used by the Quechua people for centuries. The instinct might be to rush and patent its compounds, but ethical learning starts with asking, who holds the stories behind this remedy? How can their voices guide its use? Organizations like the Amazon Conservation Team offer a blueprint, partnering directly with indigenous elders to document ethnobotanical knowledge while ensuring communities retain control over their intellectual heritage. This isn't just altruism, it's accuracy. A shaman's understanding of ayahuasca isn't just about the vine's chemistry. It's woven into rituals, songs, and generational context that labs alone can't replicate. For those eager to explore, resources like the Traditional Knowledge Digital Library, a collaboration between India and the United Nations, provide open access databases where remedies are shared with permissions clearly outlined. Platforms such as Native Land Digital map indigenous territories worldwide, reminding users that every piece of traditional knowledge is tied to a specific place and people. Even small actions matter. Purchasing crafts directly from Maya weavers or Maori carvers through fair trade collectives ensures profits bypass middlemen and flow back to knowledge keepers. The key is reciprocity, approaching learning not as extraction but as exchange. Academic disciplines are slowly shifting too. Universities like the University of Hawaii at Hilo now require researchers working with native communities to complete cultural competency training, while ethnobotanists like Dr. Wade Davis advocate for biocultural diversity frameworks that treat languages, ecosystems, and traditions as interconnected. Open-source initiatives, such as the Global Environment Facilities, work with the San people, publish findings in both scientific journals and local dialects, making knowledge accessible to those who shaped it. Yet the most profound lessons often come from stepping back. The Kogi people of Colombia, who have refused most outside contact, recently sent younger brothers, their term for humanity, a warning about environmental collapse, not through peer-reviewed papers, but via a filmed journey to their sacred peaks. Their message wasn't about sharing secrets, it was about listening to the earth as they do. Sometimes the ethical choice isn't to document or adopt, but to honor boundaries and simply bear witness. As we stand at the crossroads of climate crisis and cultural erosion, these guidelines aren't just about avoiding harm, they're about active respect, supporting native-led conservation, citing indigenous authors in research, or even learning the original names of plants and places can transform engagement from theft to partnership. The goal isn't to freeze these cultures in amber, but to walk alongside them as they evolve, ensuring their wisdom survives not as relics, but as living, breathing guides for a world in desperate need of their depth. As we've journeyed through the vast tapestry of ancient wisdom, from the self-healing concrete of Rome to the star compasses of Polynesia, from the restorative justice circles of the San to the zero-waste ingenuity of the Inuit, one truth emerges with undeniable clarity: these cultures weren't primitive. They were pioneers. Their solutions to climate crises, social fractures, and even health challenges weren't just effective. They were sustainable in the deepest sense, woven into the fabric of daily life with reverence and reciprocity. The urgency to reclaim this knowledge isn't about nostalgia, it's about survival. In a world grappling with scorching heat waves, vanishing biodiversity, and epidemic loneliness, these time-tested blueprints offer more than insight, they offer hope. Take the Three Sisters farming method, a symphony of corn, beans, and squash that outproduces monocultures while enriching the soil. Or the Maori's legal recognition of rivers as living ancestors, a radical shift that's inspiring environmental lawsuits worldwide. Even the humble talking stick, a San conflict resolution tool, is transforming boardrooms and classrooms by replacing debates with dialogues. These aren't artifacts to museumize, they're lifelines to adapt. As climate scientist Dr. Jacqueline Gill observes, the past isn't just a record, it's a laboratory. These cultures weathered droughts and famines we're only beginning to fathom. Their resilience is data written in millennia, not megabytes. Yet integrating this wisdom demands more than cherry-picking techniques. It requires embracing the world view behind them. The Haudenosaunee 7th generation principle evaluating decisions based on their impact 7 generations ahead isn't just a policy tool. It's a profound reorientation of time itself, challenging our obsession with quarterly profits and electoral cycles. Similarly, Bali's Subak water temples, which have sustained rice terraces for 1,000 years, work because farmers see their fields as sacred trusts, not commodities. As Maori elder Warihoka Wano puts it, you cannot graft an ancient tree onto modern soil and expect it to thrive. The roots must meet. So where do we begin? Start small. Plant a Three Sisters garden to experience reciprocity firsthand. Attend a restorative justice workshop to feel the power of deep listening. Support Indigenous-led conservation efforts from the Amazon's Kayapo patrols to Norway's Sami reindeer herders. And most importantly, learn to ask different questions, not, how can we exploit this resource? But what does this land need to flourish? The answers might surprise you. We'll leave you with words from the late Lakota elder chief Avo-looking horse, a keeper of the white buffalo calf pipe. All life is sacred. All life is connected. We are all related. Let this truth guide you not as a mantra but as a compass. Now, we'd love to hear which ancient practice resonates most with you. Is it the Inuits' zero-waste ethos, the Iroquois consensus governance, or something else entirely? Drop your thoughts below, and if you've enjoyed this dive into humanity's forgotten brilliance, hit subscribe. Our next adventure, uncovering the lost technologies of the Indus Valley where sewage systems and urban planning rivaled modern cities 5,000 years ago. Until then, keep looking backward to move forward. The past, it seems, has been waiting for us all.